He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is morning when we're recording here on the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast with Dr. Philip Ovadia. We are joined today by a guest where it is not morning, and that's kind of why we're recording here in the morning. Moira Newiss, welcome to the podcast. We're glad you're here.
Thank you so much. Yes, a little bit further away from you this time, and it's definitely afternoon here.
Very good. Phil, I did a little research. Why don't you give a little bit more of an introduction, and then we'll dive into it.
Yeah, excited to finally be able to have this conversation with Moira. She has been doing some amazing work across the pond, as we would say, over in the UK on, brain health, mental health, and diet. This is, part of this very exciting, I guess we could say, birth of this metabolic psychiatry movement. And we're going to talk about some of the work that she's published around that, some of the work that she's been doing. So we've been looking forward to having this conversation for a while. Moira, why don't you give a little bit of your background to our audience, let them know how you got interested in maybe nutrition to start with, and then what brought you to sort of the mental health aspects of it.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you so much. My background was that I spent 20 years as a senior manager in the NHS, which is the health service in the UK. I was a senior manager managing hospitals, lots of staff, £1 million budgets, etc. And eventually I started to burn out, had a high stress load, probably wasn't eating the best at the time. I began to just not be able to even exercise, ended up on the couch, couldn't really get off it, couldn't look after my young children. My husband was having to do all the cooking, the housework, everything. And I hit rock bottom, really. I was diagnosed with burnout and chronic fatigue, as well as a range of mental health problems, including depression and anxiety. And at that point, really, nobody had any answers for me. I was offered antidepressants. I didn't really want to take them because I thought there might be a better way of doing things. I did see a psychiatrist initially, and he actually taught me how to do deep breathing, which was really my introduction to lifestyle medicine, which I kind of credit him with, kind of starting me off on this path, which is perhaps an unusual approach, but it was good for me. So I came away, I did my breathing, I did some meditation, yoga, and things got a bit better, but they weren't fantastic. I ate better. I wasn't surviving on caffeine and chocolate any longer. And slowly my health improved.
You weren't surviving on caffeine and chocolate?
Not at that point. I had been.
I'm not aware that's even possible. This is going to be revelatory.
While I was in NHS board meetings, I would actually leave the meeting just to go and get my fix because I actually couldn't cope without having something to keep me going. That's really where I was at that point in time. I didn't realize it back then, really what was happening, but I was really struggling with my energy levels to keep going.
I don't want to stop the flow, but one of the things that occurs to me is how old were you when this began to manifest? And specifically what I'm thinking about is how many years of this high stress situation led to this?
Yeah. So with hindsight, it built for a long time. I didn't realize that kind of, when I was falling ill, I was kind of looking for all the usual answers. There must be something wrong with my bloods. Maybe I need iron, all my bloods were normal. But I'd been under a lot of stress. I was in a difficult job. I was on call as well as a senior manager. I had young children, so there's a lot going on. I had parents. I had some health issues as well, so it was coming from everywhere. And I think with hindsight, it probably built from the day I started that work, to be perfectly honest, but it didn't really manifest itself in a way that stopped me doing things for at least 10 years. And then the next 10 years were slowly downhill.
That's what I think is important. It's very easy, and I've seen this both personally and with other folks. It's very easy to not recognize what stress is doing to your body in your 20s. You can do things in your 20s that would kill anybody in their older. So it's something that built over a period of years, not days, weeks, months.
It built, and one of the early symptoms actually was that I used to go for a run on a Friday night with my friends, and then we'd go for a meal. And I actually got to the point where I couldn't do the run. I just physically couldn't do the run. So I started going for a walk instead and then going for the meal, for example. It's just little things like that where It just didn't seem to have the energy either in my brain or my body any longer to kind of do things. And I did like my job in many ways. There were lots of things that were great about it. I loved the people I worked with. There were lots of positives, but I didn't really appreciate the toll it was taking on my health at that point.
All right. Didn't mean to stop the flow, but I wanted to get a feel for how much time it takes for these things to manifest.
Absolutely. And I think, it's also maybe a good thing to point out from the point of view that, it's not going to be an overnight fix, is it? If you've had 20 years of, intense stress, it's probably going to take a little while for things to settle down again. Yeah. So even though I ended up quitting my job, that wasn't the miracle cure to just being again. So I did get into eating better. That was probably the next thing that I did. And I was eating better. So I was doing, lifestyle things in general, like holistically, but I still wasn't 100%. I was still functioning, like 60, 70, maybe up to 80% at times, but I couldn't race my bike. I couldn't climb the mountains. Didn't really feel I could hold down like a job in the same way. And then I got really interested in nutrition, thought, okay, I'm interested in this. I'd like to learn more. So I decided I would do a 3-year diploma course at the Institute of Nutrition in London. And it was really, I still wasn't 100% well, but I was on my way. In the first 6 months of that course, there was a module that took me down a bit of a deep dive into mitochondria. It wasn't really what the lecturers were expecting us to kind of be going after at this point, but I then discovered the mitochondria. And that really, for me, is, I feel, the discovery that got me back on track, because I then looked at everything I could do to optimize mitochondrial health. And that, and my focus actually was on the physical health at that point in time. It was like, I felt there was something physically wrong with my energy. I didn't really understand at that point in time that actually it could be the same issue affecting my mental health and my brain energy. And it's only with hindsight that I've connected all that together. And now, now I work much more in the field of mental health. But, people with mental health often come with chronic fatigue. People struggle to get out of bed when they're depressed. It's not, it's very much a body-wide phenomenon in many ways.
Going a little bit more into the background there, so it sounds like you came from sort of a business background. What was there something in particular that attracted you to the NHS and healthcare, or was that maybe just a happenstance that you had this business interest in healthcare and ultimately ended up more on the practice side of it?
The NHS is not really run as a business in the UK, so it was a slightly different. So I actually trained as a geologist. I was interested in volcanoes and things, so I did my first degree was in geology. And when I finished that, I'd already met my partner who I wanted to stay with in life. And being a volcanologist wasn't terribly, it wasn't something that was going to work well as a partnership with me being in Borneo and being in the UK. So I was looking for an alternative at that point in time. And I actually went to a talk by a guy, and I can remember his name. It was Ned Greenwood. I can remember because he was a remarkable guy who was recruiting people who want to work as managers in the health service, which, it's maybe not people's first thought when they're thinking about the health service. Most people are thinking about a professional clinical role of some kind. But I was really struck by, the potential there. And at that point in time, there was actually quite a lot of money still around in, the coffers in the NHS. And there was lots of excitement. You could apply to expand services, enhance things. And of course, over time, unfortunately, and one of the reasons I became so stressed was that budgets were cut and cut, staff were cut, staff were unhappy. And, it became quite a difficult thing to manage eventually. But I was really drawn in for the fact that, I wanted to modernize the health service. I wanted to help people. I wanted to, work in this system that delivers amazing care for people, because it still does in terms of acute care. It's, life-saving, it's amazing. But my journey was really interesting because I worked in all aspects of healthcare. So I actually at one point was a partner in a business running GP practices. So I moved into that side. So I kind of saw the business side. And I also, because I was then in primary care, I was seeing people coming back through the door all the time with conditions like diabetes, obesity and things. Actually, we weren't really fixing. We were just seeing them again in, a few weeks' time, weighing them, checking their bloods. And I'd kind of seen the fact that there was something wrong with the chronic disease side of things. So I kind of had exposure to that prior to doing the nutrition training, which I think actually was really valuable from where I am now.
Yeah, so I imagine you were sort of starting to make those connections it sounds like a main motivator was your own health, but were you also kind of noticing that all these people that were coming back with all these conditions that weren't getting better, and maybe, the food that they were eating was playing a role in that?
Yeah, I'd started to make connections, and when we were often tasked as managers at trying to prevent, readmissions and things like this, we were tasked with looking at, what some kind of ways to try and prevent these things happening. So I'd started, but I didn't have a grasp of metabolic health. So I hadn't really put everything together. I just knew there was probably, something was wrong with the system, the way we were doing things. We weren't really, and I now look back and think we're not even rewarding, GPs for the best standard of care with things like diabetes. We don't reward them for putting diabetes into remission, for example. There's no standard that we assess practices by how many patients they have in remission. So actually now I can see it from a very different point of view about, how maybe shifting some of those goalposts would really create a different health system.
Yeah, certainly. I think many of us feel that same way. And, you have some great examples of that over in the UK. David Unwin's work, of course, has been groundbreaking in this. And unfortunately, still struggles to kind of get the attention that it deserves. So I want to look at, and then, kind of hone in on your nutritional education. And you mentioned how you went down this sort of rabbit hole of the mitochondria. That's very interesting. Certainly not what many people in the nutritional world are focused on. Maybe it should be, because it makes perfect sense, right? That's where the food gets turned into the energy that we need to survive. But where did that kind of lead you in terms of understanding, what healthy nutrition might actually be?
So when I discovered the mitochondria, I very quickly discovered the ketogenic diet. And I began to understand, just like you say, the mitochondria can use different macronutrients, they can use glucose, they can use fat. And I began to understand that actually maybe trying a high-fat ketogenic diet might be supportive for my mitochondria. So I thought I'd give it a go. I was in my first year of training, and I dabbled in it a little bit and didn't really see the full benefits, because I didn't realize I had to do it so sustainably at this point in time. I was kind of doing it for a couple of days and falling off it again. But then I thought, no, I'll commit to it. I'll do it for a 3-month period. So I think I started in the January after Christmas, and I did it for 3 months. And at the end of the 3 months, I did my first cycle event that I'd done since I'd been ill. And I completed it. It was a 100-kilometre bike ride event called the Loch Ness Etap in the Highlands. It's quite hilly. And my aim was to do it in under 5 hours, and I did that. And I did it on a fully ketogenic diet. While everybody else is stopping at all the kind of, eating points to eat loads of glucose-based products, I wasn't doing that. I did have a bit of a backup with me just in case I needed it, because I was a bit worried in case I could do it. And actually, that was the day that I knew I'd kind of cracked my own health. I came across the finishing line. My family were there to meet me, and I was crying, and it was tears of joy. I felt amazing. I felt like I had 120% of my energy back, not just what I'd had before. I'd gone back to like teenage kind of like energy levels. And that was where I thought, okay, something changed. And then I got even more interested in trying to understand what had happened, really. And, I now know that mitochondria, have so many different functions, and that the way you treat them, whether it's with food, movement, sleep, light, all these different factors that play into it, it has an impact on how they produce and kind of allocate energy in the body. And that's, what I'm currently actually writing a book, and it's very much based on mitochondria and what happens, to the flow of energy in the body, because what I've come to understand is that, we have a certain kind of energy envelope in life, but if things aren't going well for some reason, we've got inflammation, or we've got immune system activation, or we're not sleeping well, then, that some of that energy is going to be diverted to go and deal with the problem. And as a result, that's likely to give us symptoms, which sometimes get talked about as sickness behaviours, that the mitochondria will kind of allocate energy, and therefore they'll also take it away from some other places. And that will tend to make us want to sleep, have fatigue, put our head down, and what we need to do is kind of real work of a guy called Dr. Martin Picard. I don't know if you've come across him. He's based at Columbia University in the US, but he talks about it through a lens of energy transformation and energy resistance. And what he's saying is that we basically need to have the right amount of energy resistance in the body, not too little, not too much. A bit like if you think of an electrical circuit, if there's too much, then you don't get, light from a light bulb. But if there's too little, actually, it will go on fire, So it's balancing this. And I quite like that concept, really, that, we need to kind of get the right balance in our life for our mitochondria.
I've never heard that particular analogy before of the obviously we want to provide the positive power, but I've never heard anybody talk about the energy resistance. We may not go down this road in this conversation, but I'm going to make a note of it and see what I can learn.
Yeah, I think that work is really fascinating. It's kind of connecting physics with biology, which I think is maybe something that is not really, we tend to separate the sciences out, and maybe that's what we need to come back to, because at the end of the day, energy is the currency of life. Without energy, we are dead, aren't we?
That is what death is.
Yeah, it's when energy stops flowing, and the most obvious, examples of some of this are, toxins, which block the mitochondria and can kill you like very quickly, for example. So it all comes back, I think, to basically how electrons flow through the mitochondria. It is what's happening. And there are so many different systems in the body, even if you were just thinking about, something like how proteins get made, something which probably nobody thinks about very much, but, our bodies are kind of, everything is built around how proteins are made in the body and how they're then broken down, recycled and reused. And, mitochondria play lots of roles in supporting that function, from providing the energy for it to happen, so to help in clear it up, process if things go wrong. And then there's evidence that, many of these processes kind of appear in all sorts of different conditions, including mental health conditions as well.
As you were kind of, discovering these things, learning these things, was it kind of, was this something that was supported sort of, by your mentors, your education overall, or was this stuff that you were kind of having to figure out on your own outside of the sort of standard curriculum maybe that you were being put through?
So I would say I was figuring some of it out on my own. I think I was very lucky that the place I trained wanted to be really at the cutting edge of nutrition. And so a lot of stuff we were sent away to question, to look at. And the dean of that institute, called Heather Rosa, I'm still very friendly with her. And she is very much into metabolic health, mitochondria, supportive strategies for those things. And I know they're teaching more of that now than when I was there, because it is a few years ago now. So I think that is changing, but I'm still questioned in the nutrition world about some of what I do. Is a ketogenic diet sustainable? Is it good for you? Is it good for your heart? All these things. I mean, just this morning I was on a group call with some of the nutritionists, and we were talking a little bit about the carnivore diet, which is obviously one extreme end of the ketogenic diet. And, lots of questions about whether that's actually good for you, whether it's good for your gut, for example. And I'm saying, have you looked at the research? Because there's actually a lot of research coming forward now that is suggesting it can be a really good therapeutic way of supporting gut health if you've got really inflamed bowels, for example. So I think there's still a way to go, but I think it's moving in the right direction.
Great. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about maybe what your personal experience was with it. You mentioned, being able to kind of get back to the racing, but talk about, a little bit more the impact it had on your personal life. And then I'd like to start to kind of hear how you then, put this into a professional practice.
Yeah. So it had an amazing impact on my personal life, because I got my life back. It literally transformed my life. I mean, I was really at rock bottom. I mean, I actually used to get in the car and drive to a certain crossroads and think, should I just not go home again? And that's really how bad it was. I was really at rock bottom. And, to come out the other side, not only to have retrained, but have run my own business now for several years and be publishing things like that is amazing, really, when I look back to where I was. And I honestly thought at one time I really lost hope, because nobody seemed to know how to get me better again. So, I have kind of stood in those shoes and realize, now when I'm working with clients, how, I can really empathize about how difficult that can feel. My husband was incredibly supportive, and without him, things would have collapsed really around the home. So it affected me lots of ways, but also, all my interests were outdoor interests. They were active interests. So I'd kind of lost lots of friendships and things because I couldn't participate. So I got back on track, and then, yeah, just over time, I was able to build a business up again and do it my own way this time. So not managed by anybody else. I can do it the way I want to do it. And that makes it much more manageable, because to start with, I was a little bit concerned, could I cope with all this again? So I went into it slowly. And you don't start a business, overnight. You don't have loads of clients. It builds up slowly anyway. And it gives you, and over time you gain confidence that actually this is fine. This is sustainable. My energy levels have not, I've not had any kind of derailment of it. I know how to keep myself healthy and fit now. Yeah.
We've been doing this for quite a while, well over 200 episodes, and we've had a lot of people talk about their own personal experience getting healthy by going to a high-fat diet. Most of these conversations, folks are talking about the physical benefits. We've had very few who've talked about mental health specifically. Just before you came on, Phil and I were talking about, I have someone close to me who struggled with mental health issues for all her life. And I think not coincidentally, she's also obese. And I just to explore with somebody who's gone through it,
yeah,
what it's like to have the mental health issues on the inside. We've had Chris Palmer on, we've had Georgia Eade on, we've heard it from the clinical side, but for folks who struggle with the mental health stuff, I'm interested in what your experience was. And I mean, it may be super simple, but it fascinates me.
Yeah, I mean, the way I felt mentally was drained, both physically and mentally. There was nothing more to give. I had really bad brain fog. I was struggling to read a book, for example. I couldn't really concentrate. Before I stopped work, I was very worried about making mistakes. I'd made a few mistakes on spreadsheets and things. I was very worried about, my cognitive ability and things like that. I have a family history of dementia and Alzheimer's. None of my family are obese. In fact, we're all very lean, interestingly. However, I suspect that, certainly with my father, for example, I suspect he was quite insulin resistant because he had no teeth left. He'd had a high sugar diet. There were other signs that there was probably something going on there. I suppose, I just felt, and I did feel like I'd lost hope in a way, really, that there was going to be a way to recover. I felt like I might have to live like this. And that was really quite some thought, because I wasn't really living a kind of life that I wanted to live. So I don't know if that explains it enough, but
depression is so common. And my suspicion, because I am deeply cynical about the entire pharmaceutical industry, is that prescribing antidepressant drugs is a real cash cow. Undoubtedly, there are people whose depression has a psychological root, but it doesn't sound like that's the situation with you. And my suspicion is it might not be the situation with a majority of people who are struggling with depression.
Yeah, so I mean, I had severe anxiety as well as depression, really, really severe anxiety, actually. What I would say, having learned what I now know about the mitochondria, is that psychological stress can impact them just as much as things that you might think of as more physical.
Yeah.
Actually, really, because, stress can affect your metabolism, So really, I don't really separate that out so much now. I just think that probably for the majority of people, maybe a combined strategy is going to be a good idea. Because some of the work actually that Dr. Martin Picard's looking at in his lab is looking at how positive psychological experiences impact the mitochondria. And that's really interesting, because that shows that actually they have positive psychological experience have a positive effect on the mitochondria. So I kind of look at it from the point of view that I was trying to do that stuff. I was trying to do yoga, meditation, and mindfulness, and it was helping. It just didn't tip it enough for me, in the right direction. And I think it was when I added the ketogenic diet in that tip happened. So I can kind of think that if you're thinking from a personal point of view, everybody's going to be different in what they need to get well again. And maybe there comes a tipping point at which the ketogenic diet can correct things that can't be done. Because people sometimes think, how can a diet correct something that's psychological stress? But I do kind of believe that's kind of what happened for me. It kind of corrected it more than just the psychological stuff did. So I kind of look at it from a slightly different lens now and think that really I'm just looking at it through the lens of the mitochondria. And, psychological stress adversely affects the mitochondria just like high sugar diets do, for example, or toxins, or, even, if you think of things on a wider basis, we know lots of lonely people are depressed.
Yeah,
So
sure.
loneliness is a factor. And again, you could argue there's ways to address that. But again, maybe all these things come back to how really simply the electrons flow through the mitochondria, and we just need to kind of optimize it. That's where I've come to, which is perhaps a jump for some people, but that's really what I now have come to believe. And I think there's lots of science really that backs that up now from lots of different directions.
Yeah, it's a kind of fascinating way to look at it, And again, we have seen this over and over again, right? That people that, improve their metabolic health that, may not have had, any sort of significant mental health issue, but, they're always like, my mood is better, my energy is better. I don't have the brain fog, right? The things like that seem to pretty consistently get better when people improve their metabolic health. And, I mean, even my personal, me personally, I can say, right? I never thought that I had an issue with any of this. I was kind of tired, and yeah, I'm a busy surgeon and I'm stressed, but the difference now, just how you react to those stressful situations, when you have this sort of alteration in your, a lot of times people will point to it as sort of a brain chemistry issue, but I kind of, like your perspective, see your perspective on it's really the mitochondrial, it's the energy flow, through the brain, which kind of ties back to what we see on the heart, and the effects of ketogenic diets on the heart and how it can improve the functioning of the heart because of that effect that it's having on the mitochondria.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually in the process of publishing a second case report at the moment, which is a case about severe anxiety. And it's actually quite interesting because the reason I've chosen to publish it is because this is somebody who works as a contemplative scientist in, the field of psychology and using, things like meditation and things like that. And yet somebody who was, a scientist in that field couldn't control their own anxiety. And it wasn't until they did a ketogenic diet that they could get the benefits of those things. So again, it kind of shows that there's some effect that maybe a ketogenic diet can just kind of push somebody more towards, more so than just the psychological aspect alone in some situations.
Awesome. Yeah, which maybe leads us to the first case report that you published about, I guess it's been about 8 months now, middle of last year, that you published a pretty dramatic case report on schizophrenia. We'll call it reversal. Some people would call it cure with dietary therapy. So maybe go into that case report a little bit, some of the unique aspects, and then that will kind of lead us. I want to talk about some of the recent controversy here in the US around this idea that, psychiatric conditions can be treated with dietary therapy.
Yeah, so this was a case report that I published of a relatively young man who had some difficult life circumstances. He'd had to move out of his family home due to the death of his mother. He'd ended up in a homeless situation. This is prior to me meeting him. He had developed psychological symptoms that eventually led to a diagnosis of schizophrenia. While he was in a homeless hostel initially, he came across a book by a guy called Tim Ferriss, who you might have heard of.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, he's quite well known, called The Tools of the Titans. And in that, there is a section about ketogenic diets. Now, that book is not a book about metabolism. It's like a self-help book to improve your life. And that's really what it's about. And in that, and so this guy thought, my life's pretty terrible. I want to try and improve it. So he thought, I'll try a ketogenic diet. But he was doing it, a couple of days on, a couple of days off, etc. to begin with. And on the days where he wasn't doing the ketogenic diet, he was experiencing, he was eating quite a lot of high sugar and experiencing quite severe mood disruptions. And eventually, at one point, he was sectioned. So he was in and out of hospital for a few years. Section. So I don't know what that is in the US, but that's where you are forcibly kind of
okay.
Committed.
Committed, yeah. Okay. So he was in a mental health hospital and in and out for several years. felt really, and he was getting the kind of usual standard care of treatment. He was on medication. He was getting what we'd call occupational therapy support, which included things like group visits to the library, group chats about your mental health, etc. And he didn't really feel any of that improved his mental health particularly, although it obviously kept him a little bit more stable, perhaps being in that situation. The interesting thing is that when he was, prior to being hospitalized, he was actually doing the ketogenic diet in a homeless shelter. He had a little mini portable grill and a mini fridge, and he was able to do he did have access to some money, and he was able to actually manage a ketogenic diet in that situation. So when people say it's really difficult to do, I'm like, okay, maybe, but it can be done in quite limited situations. When he came out of hospital, he contacted me, was living with some family, and he wanted to try a ketogenic diet. By that time, he'd come across Chris Palmer and George Ede and Metabolic Mind, and he had kind of thought, there's something in this. I need to, he thought I did feel better when I was doing it on the days when I did it. So he thought, I want to do it properly. So we did a very simple approach. It was mainly a carnivore ketogenic diet. It became purely carnivore when he wasn't able to stay with his family any longer for various reasons. And it had to go back to being a very simple approach. And he basically did a 2-to-1 ratio, which is 2 grams of fat for every 1 gram of protein and carbohydrates combined. So we made sure he was getting sufficient protein. So he was, by the time he had moved out of the family house, he was actually in homeless accommodation again, which in this situation was a hotel. And he only had a microwave to cook with. And he was basically eating beef mince, ground mince, and tallow. And that was literally it, because it was all he could, it had to be very simple cooking as well. But he kept religiously to that ratio, and he has not had another episode. And I've been in touch with him relatively recently, another episode of mood disorder again. He is off all his medication, and he is now volunteering in the mental health service to help other people. So I wanted to publish it really just to show that, often there's criticism of ketogenic diets being difficult to do, being expensive to do, requiring lots of expensive meat, for example, and the reality is that, I can't remember what the amount was in dollars, but, he was spending less than £5 a day on food, which is really not very much.
Yeah, about $3.50.
Yeah, so it's, for me, I just think that, okay, I don't see many people like that in my clinical practice. People like that don't generally come to me, but actually I'm on a bit of a mission as well. It's not just about me and my business. This is about I'd like to see mental health services taking this on this approach as an adjunctive, if that's a word, is it? I don't know. Yep. An extra thing, in their range of strategies. And, there's more and more interest. I've got a few people in the mental health service coming to me to try ketogenic diet so they know how to do it properly, which is really great to see now. And, it is going to be people from the ground up, I think, that get the change to happen. That's what I firmly believe. It's unlikely to be the top down. I think it's going to be a bottom up approach that kind of is a movement.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing, so many aspects of that case report, right, that dispel all of these, myths, right, that people have about ketogenic diets. And, just the challenging circumstances that he was under and was still able to do this really, hopefully, will inspire a lot of interest. And, you're probably aware that recently over here in the US, right, Robert F. Kennedy said, essentially that psychiatric conditions can be treated with dietary therapy. And there was just amazing amount of pushback against that, and that he had just basically made this up and there was no evidence that this worked. So maybe your perspective on that, because obviously there is evidence, it's published. This isn't the only case report that I'm aware of. This is something that's now being actively studied in, I think, both in the UK and the US that I'm aware of. So talk about, your clinical experience and your perspective on that.
Yeah, just as you rightly said, there is lots of building evidence. So there are plenty of case reports published in a wide range of mental health conditions. I mean, actually, just this week, a US mental health counsellor, Nicole Laurent, published a case about post-traumatic stress disorder using the ketogenic diet, for example. So, it's growing in its breadth. But there are also quite a number of randomized control trials now that have been completed as well for a range of conditions. There was one I think it was just 2 weeks ago in the UK. Oxford University have done the first UK ketogenic trial for depression, for example. So the it's building all the time, partly because the Bazooki Foundation in the US, which is a philanthropic foundation, has invested a lot of money in supporting these trials, in the UK and in the US and elsewhere now. And, that came from the background that their son, used a ketogenic diet to recover from his mental illness. So that's all growing in terms of what's actually published in the literature, which is great. And there is more money coming in. In the UK, there's actually quite a lot of money being put into universities to look at different aspects of metabolic health linked to mental health. And interestingly, some areas are joining up their research between things like cardiology and mental health, which is really fascinating to see. In terms of my clinical practice, I do get people coming with a wide range of different mental health problems, combined sometimes with physical problems. I mean, because I have worked quite a lot with chronic fatigue, and often people with chronic fatigue have a mental health condition too, so I have a lot of clients like that. I would say that, the vast majority of them see a significant improvement on a ketogenic diet. And, even sometimes people just going low carb see improvements, but, the ketogenic diet does seem to just have this additional effect for many people that is just kind of helping. I call it really, it's like resetting their metabolic health and their brain energy. And you can do it in different ways. I mean, not everybody has to do like a carnivore approach, although, that's often does get talked about now. But, I've had people even do a vegetarian approach. I mean, I'm not a big fan of vegetarian diets generally, but, there are people who do see benefits from trying these approaches. As long as they're eating enough fat and they're getting the micronutrients in, then it seems to be that there is potential there, even on a wide range of ketogenic diets.
So you mentioned chronic fatigue. That's still a bit of a black box in medicine, right? There are still many people within the medical world that, would say it's not a real diagnosis. But, that would seem to naturally point towards, right? It's chronic fatigue. You don't have enough energy. Maybe we should be looking at the mitochondria as the solution for this. Talk a little bit more about your experience with that. Maybe, talk a little bit about what is chronic fatigue? How do we differentiate just being tired because, you have a busy life and you have kids and you have work and all of that stuff versus, when we really can make that diagnosis and how it lends itself to metabolic therapy?
Yeah, so you're right. It's a controversial topic still. And, very controversially, if you talk about chronic fatigue with mental health, because often people don't like the connotation there might be a link there. I mean, I didn't. So I'm coming from the background. I was very much focused on my chronic fatigue and not my mental health problems to begin with. I felt there was something kind of physically wrong. And that was why I gravitated to that side of things. I think with all these things, there's a spectrum. And actually, many people with chronic fatigue do have some element of cognition problems, brain fog, or more diagnosed mental health issues. There's a spectrum, and the same the other way around. So people with depression can be very fatigued, for example. So there's already an overlap there when we're talking, just generally. But I think in terms of, chronic fatigue, then people are tending to think more about body systems like muscles, for example, and things like exercise intolerance, which is often linked to chronic fatigue, where people have a kind of delayed effect. They can, if they do too much exercise a day, they can't, they feel terrible tomorrow, sort of thing. I think all of that really does come back again to the mitochondria, because it doesn't really matter whether you're making energy in a neuron in your brain or in your muscle cells. It's the same process to make energy. We all use the fuel, which is ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is basically, as you started right at the beginning explaining, is where we take the nutrients from our food and the oxygen we breathe. They go into the mitochondria, and through a process, ATP is produced. And that's something that happens in almost every cell in the body. And that's why I think, that when people do studies on conditions like chronic fatigue, they tend to be looking at one kind of element. So they're looking to see, is there an immune problem? Is there a viral problem here? Or is there, some kind of, is it about insulin or glucose? Or is it, something in the brain? It's separated out in many of these times, or is it about inflammation? Inflammation is always a big one. And the reality is that I think when you think back to how the mitochondria partition the energy that they use, it's not surprising some people might have a slightly different set of symptoms to somebody else, because we're all different and our bodies are going to respond differently to the situation we're in. So whereas somebody might end up with a very raised inflammatory response and somebody else might end up with, slightly different presenting pattern, it might still be that it's mitochondrial dysfunction that's underneath both those situations. I hope I'm making sense here, but I kind of think that I quite like the view that Chris Palmer has when he talks about this for mental health, because he kind of talks about it being a transdiagnostic approach. And I actually think that applies to chronic fatigue too, in that, many of the markers, that can be measured, so inflammation being a good one. If you do a trial, if you measure inflammation in mental health disorders, there's usually a finding that inflammation markers are raised, and that's the same in chronic fatigue, for example. It doesn't mean that every single person in that trial had a raised marker. It just means that the average is going to be that you're more likely to see it if you've got chronic fatigue. And he also talks about the fact that ketogenic diet is transdiagnostic because it's tackling the same processes with so the metabolic process and the inflammatory process. And I think that's because when you come down to the level of the mitochondria, the way we make our ATP varies a little bit depending on whether we use fat and ketones or whether we use glucose. And what we want to do is create as little inflammation during that process as possible. So we have things called reactive oxygen species that are generated when we are making ATP. It will happen anyway, and we need a certain amount to send the right signals to the body. There is this kind of signaling component. But if we make too many of those, if the mitochondria become slightly kind of uncoupled and we allow more reactions with oxygen, then we get more of these reactive oxygen species. And that is really what starts the inflammatory process. It creates oxidative stress and tissue damage. And if there's enough damage, it'll start to affect organ function, tissue function, organ function. And of course, that can be different in different places in the body because the mitochondria are amazingly clever. They're involved in, they make lots of important things like hormones in some places in the body, for example. If you're experiencing a lot of metabolic stress in an organ that makes hormones, you're probably going to have hormonal dysregulation, for example. So it's complicated, and it's probably too complicated to go into the detail here today. But I do think that, we are beginning to understand how this works. And I think that's partly why we see different patterns in different people, is that the mitochondria might be more affected in one area of the body than another.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think people don't, maybe get down to that level often. And we talk about, even within the metabolic health space, right? We talk about your body's either using, glucose and sugar for energy, or it's using, fats via ketone for energy. But we don't really think about, right? In the end, we only use ATP for energy, right? It's just, what is that ATP being made from? And even the whole just sort of evolutionary theory and history around, where the mitochondria came from, right? And that these are maybe remnants of bacteria or viruses that were incorporated into the first sort of cellular organisms, multicellular organisms, and that the mitochondria really is a sort of life entity of its own.
Yeah. And, when we come back to talk about, mental health, we talk about the brain, ATP is involved in so many processes, from growing, creating new neurons, creating synapses, the connection between the different cells in the brain, the release of neurotransmitters. It all requires energy. They're all energy dependent. It all requires ATP. It requires mitochondria to be in the right place, in the right concentration. And that requires different proteins to shuttle them in the right place, So it is complicated, but I think we're beginning to understand how some of these things, work together, and how, different, somebody who's got a bipolar diagnosis, somebody who's got a depression diagnosis, it's just that things are being impacted in a slightly different way. Probably we don't know all the detail, but the reality is that one aspect of that neurotransmission or brain connection is going to be affected more in one person and in a different way in another person, probably. But the amazing thing is that ketogenic diets can work to not only deliver energy, more effectively, really. But, they're anti-inflammatory in several different ways. They've got a directly anti-inflammatory impact. They help support the things like brain plasticity and neurotransmission and things. So there's a lot of reasons, actually, that ketones in the brain in particular, can be really beneficial.
Yeah, that reminds me about that ketogenic diet has been known to help with epilepsy for over 100 years, is my understanding. So that would make sense. I'm sorry, Phil, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No, I was going to follow up just on the ketone, sort of issue. What are your thoughts on, we'll call it endogenous, right? Ketones, generating it with your diet versus what role exogenous ketones. We now have ketone supplementation products in various forms. And where do you see that playing a role in this as well?
I have to admit, I don't do a lot of work with exogenous ketones. I have experimented a little bit myself, but I generally do it by diet with my clients. And that's not to say that somebody shouldn't try that. It's just that I think there are additional benefits from doing it with the diet, in my view, because as soon as you stop taking a supplement, then you're going to stop. You won't have the ketones for a start. If you're trying to heal a condition, I think you really need, especially a brain health condition, you really need the brain to be continually exposed to ketones, is my view. I mean, some of the supplements are quite expensive too, which is a bit of an issue. So I think, I do sometimes use things like MCT oil, which is a kind of, it's not a ketone itself, but it's quite ketogenic. And that can be helpful, especially if people are struggling a bit to get the ketones up initially. Sometimes it can be helpful. It can also be really helpful if people are traveling and things like that, and they've maybe not got as much access. I've done ketogenic diets, climbing in the Swiss Alps and things. I appreciate it's difficult to do, and you have to kind of think and plan ahead, especially if you're not in control of your food, it is more difficult. So I think there's definitely a role for things like that. I haven't really used them so much in clinical practice, to be honest. So you've maybe got more experience than me there.
Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting aspects that maybe the exogenous ketones miss, right, is that, ketones aren't one thing. There are a lot of ketones that our bodies make, right, when we're in a ketogenic, metabolic state. Whereas, when we're measuring ketones, we're only really measuring one particular ketone, beta hydroxybutyrate. And then a lot of the exogenous ketone products, they're all a particular ketone, right,
Yeah.
that they're providing. And I think you're right that there's a lot, it's still a little bit different than when you're just in a ketogenic metabolic state and your body's probably making, many different types of ketones that have these different effects, the anti-inflammatory and the various other effects that we see from ketogenic diets in general. And
just add to that I think the other benefit of doing it with diet is that you're really trying to get a macronutrient rich diet in at the same time, and so that I think is important too, especially for some people who might be missing micronutrients to begin with. So I think that there's two things happening at the same time in a way with a ketogenic diet. Is if you do it a well-formulated ketogenic diet, then you're getting the micronutrients and the high fat content. So for me, I think that's probably a better approach. But there's definitely a role for exogenous ketones. Potentially, I think they're being used in dementia a bit, for example, where it's maybe more difficult to get people to eat a ketogenic diet, and I know that there's been experiments, in the military and other ways where they found sort of positive benefits.
Yeah, certainly. I guess, as we kind of are approaching the end of the conversation here, where are you hoping this goes next? What are you working on, and what do you hope to see happen now that we, have this accumulating evidence of the benefit of ketogenic metabolic therapies?
So I would really hope that it's taken up mainstream, maybe not overnight, but, I think there's a lot of people who are really dedicated to trying to make this happen now in the research field, in the clinical field, and the expert patient field, because there's a lot of people who have, benefited now who are speaking up. So there's all of that. Personally, I've written a book. It's being edited at the moment, which is really all about how mitochondria work, how energy flows in the body, so I'm hoping that will help get the word out to a kind of wider audience as well. And I will be launching a group coaching cohort later this year, because I haven't done that up to now. I've always worked one-to-one with people, but I am aware there's greater demand, and also, people who don't have the budget to always work one-to-one with people as well. So that's on the horizon for me. And I'm actually I'm on the scientific committee of the Public Health Collaboration, which is a UK charity which has a mission to improve society's metabolic health. And, they are very much in, promoting, low carb and ketogenic diets for a variety of conditions, really. And just, campaigning to try and get our government to listen. There are people on there. We were just looking, the new NICE guidelines for diabetes were published the other day, and there's a little bit of disappointment that some of the science that's been presented doesn't feel like it's been taken on board again. But we have to keep trying. That's the thing. And I've currently got a petition out on change.org if anyone wants to sign that, to try and get our UK government to follow suit and review the dietary guidelines, full stop. That's one of my aims at the moment. Yeah.
Excellent.
Mora, give us where do folks who are eligible to sign that? If you're in the UK, you're eligible. If you're in the US, they don't care.
No, it's not. It's more UK people I'm after for that. It's change.org. The petition is called Overhaul the UK Dietary Guidelines.
Overhaul the UK Dietary. Okay, I'll make sure that shows up in the show notes as well.
Yeah, that's great. And anybody who wants to know more, I've got quite a few blogs and, free downloads on my website. If anyone's interested, I've got a nice 10-tip ebook on there. And you can find me by my name. I'm the only Moira Newiss in the world, luckily for me. So I'm quite easy to track down.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll definitely make sure all of the resources are there. I think, I definitely encourage people to follow your work. Looking forward to the book, looking forward to the next case report that you're working on. And you've been doing some great work over there.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to both of you, Philip and Jack. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time to do this.
Very good. Mora's website is moranewiss.co.uk. Did I get that right? I believe so.
That's right.
moranewiss.co.uk. She's on LinkedIn. She's on YouTube. She's got a lot of good stuff on her website, and that is certainly applicable to anyone, regardless of where you live. And then, of course, for those UK residents, the change.org petition, I'll make sure that's also on the show notes. All right. This has been Stay Off My Operating Table. Our guest has been Moira Newiss. Thanks for being with us. We'll talk to you all next time.
Chances are you wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you didn't need to change your life and get healthier. So take action right now. Book a call with Dr. Ovadia's team. One small step in the right direction is all it takes to get started. Contact us at ifixhearts.com/talk. That's ifixhearts.com/talk.